And now, the First Alert Storm Team, live from the 13 Now Digital Desk. This is Tropic Topics, sponsored by Peden Heating and Air Conditioning and Mariana Toyota.
Welcome to Tropic Topics. I'm Chief Meteorologist Ross Whitley. We're talking all about what you can see right there on your lower third. That is Tropical Storm Fiona. And there's a lot of questions left to be answered here, really in the short range and medium range. Once we get past this interaction with the Greater Antilles, we're going to see a much better understanding of what inevitably happens to the storm. But until then, there's still a whole lot of question marks and a lot of potential outcomes that still are there. There's favored outcomes and things that appear to be much more likely than the others, but there are still certain variables there that can kind of disrupt those odds and change things. So we're certainly going to be watching how things trend as we do go forward, but it's all about Tropical Storm Fiona and all about the tropics. So unlike last week where we were talking about the heavy rain setup, thankfully we are not talking about heavy rain across our area anytime soon. And before I really jump into anything, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything like that, you can go ahead and throw those into the chat section of wherever you're watching from. I've got them all pulled up and we will answer those questions hopefully as we go along. But if we don't answer those questions as we go along, I will certainly get to them at the end as much as possible. So I appreciate everyone tuning in. We're going to jump right into it. Right now you can see there's not a whole lot going on here. We do have our nice false returns showing up as well as the shower and thunderstorm activity well offshore. That's because dry air is in place. We did squeeze out a little more moisture, meaning we mixed out the moisture that was at the surface, especially right along the coast, which is what was responsible for the cloud cover thanks to that sea breeze. But the northeast wind is winning overall. We'll start to squeeze out some more moisture and even actually see some precipitation chances as we go into tomorrow, Saturday, and Sunday. Then drier air comes right back in as we get into Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of next week. So it looks like we're in a nice dry stretch here of weather. We certainly needed it after all the rain we got last weekend to go through much of this week with low rain chances, and then through the weekend with low rain chances, and much of next week likely with low rain chances. Looks pretty good. So that is the good news. The bad news is that we are watching the tropics pretty intently, and there's no lack of ocean heat content. That is what hurricanes and tropical systems work off of, is the ocean heat content. So they work off of fluxes. Unlike our over-the-land storms that work off of temperature indifference, meaning that you need cooler air lifting warmer air at a tilt. That's what we get as far as baroclinic strengthening. Over tropical strengthening, it all comes from heat fluxes with that warm air rising in the center. So that's what you want. You actually want suppressive air over top as opposed to over land where you want a low pressure over top. Tropical systems are different. You want the low pressure at the surface and high pressure aloft so that you can radiate out all of that heat energy in all directions, which is why you get that nice cyclone form. So that's what we're watching here. We've got plenty of heat content available to it. What we do not have available to it is moist air. It is still very, very dry over the Atlantic, and we have quite a bit of shear as well. You can see all of the dry Saharan dust that is up in the atmosphere, which is very, very unusual for this time of year. Typically, we're not talking about Saharan dust anywhere in the Atlantic this time of year, and we're still holding on to it here. And it is even going to be entrained in this tropical system and continue to be pressed across the Atlantic as we go through the foreseeable future, which is why the tropics have just been so inactive, really, thanks to stable conditions and dry air. Here is Tropical Storm Fiona, and if you ever wanted to see an exposed core on a tropical system, there it is. All the convection blowing up on the east side of the system, and all where the core is, I'm going to highlight it for you here. That's where the core is right there, and of course all of the convection is on the east side. So this is what I'm talking about. That's where all the convection. So why do we have the exposed core? Well, we have strong westerly shear that is blowing those cloud tops off. So we're actually getting the lift right over the core, but it's being sheared in that direction. So where the cloud tops are actually happening is where we have that wind shear pushing the cloud tops too. So the core is completely exposed. That does not allow for strengthening So this is expected to remain a weak tropical system as it does move toward the greater Antilles. Their biggest impact is going to be, unfortunately for them, rainfall as this does continue to slide off to the east. And it's moving fairly decently. It's moving at about 13 miles per hour off to the west. And again, it's facing that heavy shear, and that shear is not really going anywhere, nor is the dry air. You can see the dry air that's already entrained in it. So this is likely going to remain a relatively weak storm, and we'll get to the potential solutions here as it does remain a relatively weak storm. And there are quite a few potential solutions. It's a 50-mile-per-hour max wind storm right now. Hurricane hunters are flying to the storm, so our models this evening and then tonight and tomorrow should be much better and give us a better understanding as what potential environment is around this storm and what's in the storm, and hopefully the models have a better idea of how to handle this going forward, because believe it or not, those short-range hurricane models actually don't incorporate any shear whatsoever, which is why you get these runaway, rampant hurricane models that show just massive strengthening because they don't incorporate that shear. And the actual solutions on the hurricane models show us that there is shear out there, which is kind of hilarious. But as far as the National Hurricane Center goes, the forecast, at least officially right now, is for this to brush with Puerto Rico as basically a strong end tropical storm, and then bridge the gap between Hispaniola and Puerto Rico, and then move toward the Bahamas and curve out into the Atlantic from there. So right now, there is basically no threat to the U.S. whatsoever. Where things become muddled is that our modeling doesn't necessarily represent this as the only range of possibilities. There's quite a few range of possibilities. So right now, this is what the National Hurricane Center is going with, and this is the most likely solution, which is a stronger solution. So the storm stays relatively intact. It is sheared, but it stays as a stronger tropical storm. And then as it interacts with Puerto Rico and Hispaniola, eventually it curves. And even with this solution, I would say that the Northeast in general, really through the Carolinas up into the Northeast, would want to pay attention to this, just because there is possibilities where high pressure builds to the north and tries to push this back in that direction, and then maybe brushes and recurves out into the Atlantic from there. So that's something that we definitely want to watch for. Even if this solution does play out, it's possible that the east coast of the U.S. has to deal with something, even if we get this stronger solution where we get this recurve away. So that is the most likely solution at this point in time, because that's what most of the modeling has showed us, which would mean the U.S. has very little threat whatsoever. However, there are other possible solutions, including a weaker solution where the storm stays further off to the south. And in this case, it would more than likely miss Puerto Rico because the overall steering currents would push it further to the south and further to the east. And in this case, we're probably talking about the storm going directly over those 14,000 foot tall mountains that are in Hispaniola, which would mean the storm would be heavily ripped apart. And then we would have to wait and see where this storm redeveloped. And the center redevelopment would definitely be key in the overall forecast, because in this solution, we would have the storm reemerge into the water somewhere through here, and it's possible with that you still have it picked up by the trough and curved off to the north. It's possible that you still get a solution like that. It's possible that you get a solution like this, where it's going up into the Carolinas, or even a possible solution like that, where it goes into the peninsula and then up the east coast, because we're not going to see this travel too far west. I would say the most western solution where it gets close to us would be obviously something that went like this, but that seems very unlikely at this point in time, just because of the overall way that our long-range pattern, our long-wave pattern is going to develop, and I'll get to more on that in just a second. The other solution, and least likely right now, is where things become very, very muddled. So you get a really weak storm that gets heavily sheared, and we have a hard time finding the center, and then it continues to progress off to the west and goes over Hispaniola, and then we have to wait and see where the center redevelopment happens. And in this case, the ridge that is off to the north and will be building over us will likely be steering this further and further off to the west. So in this case, you've got a weak storm, and that does put the Gulf of Mexico in play. However, as I will explain more in a moment, a high pressure being centered right over here, it seems very unlikely that you would have any issues through basically that area because we're going to remember clockwise flow around high pressure systems. So anything that did emerge into this area would either have to curve back that way or it would have to go that way, which is why right now I'm fairly comfortable at saying that we have a very, very, very low risk, if any risk at all, of seeing any kind of impacts from Fiona, unless it's just a brushing impact as the storm passes by just off to our east or just well off to our south. So at the moment, it appears that there's very low risk to the Panhandle in general for this storm to come directly here. There is a possible solution where that happens, but it's one where you would have the storm hanging out in the Gulf of Mexico for several days, waiting for a trough to come in. The ridge would have to weaken, and then you'd see the storm recurve back up to the northern Gulf of Mexico. So that seems to be a very unlikely solution at this point in time. It's possible, sure. I'm not saying it's not possible, but it's certainly not probable right now. And in forecasting, it's all about probability. So you're always going to go with the odds and what's the greatest odds over the outliers. And outliers do occasionally become correct, but they're not usually correct, which is why you go with the probabilities. And hurricane models here, again, don't account for wind shear, but the hurricane models show basically the stronger solution. And you can see the National Hurricane Center's forecast being right there in the center envelope of the hurricane model. So it does show that interaction with Puerto Rico and then bridging the gap and going right between Puerto Rico and Hispaniola and not going over those mountains and then recurving out into the Atlantic. That's also what the GFS shows. So zooming in here on Fiona, you can see the exposed core, but as we pull up the GFS, you'll notice that it does show that weakness in the ridge and has the storm developing, strengthening, and then going up through the ridge. Does make at least an attempt to develop into the ridge, which could potentially pull it into, of course, the northeast, which is still a possibility, which remember I said, even if this stronger solution plays out, if you're up the eastern seaboard from really the Carolinas all the way up into Maine, I would still want to be watching because even in this solution, you could get some kind of merger with the trough and see this kind of try to slingshot back off to the east. So even in the stronger solution, the East Coast still needs to be paying attention to this. But this does at least highlight what I was talking about here, whereas basically this area where the ridge has developed is not going to see the storm. So you could have a storm come out where it's weaker and it do something like that. You could have a storm go like this, or you could have a storm come up and try to go into the ridge like that. So the chances that you're going to see something come up, go into the Gulf of Mexico, and then curve back into our area would be extremely low at this point in time because we're definitely going to get that ridge to develop. It's just where's the storm, how strong is the storm, and what's the steering current. Obviously, the stronger solutions, as we just highlighted, will recurve. The weaker solutions are going to be further off to the east, but eventually they're likely going to recurve. The question becomes really is as this trough passes on by, if the storm misses the trough because it's weak, well, then do you get a high pressure system to build here? And if you get a high pressure system to build here, that really puts the East Coast and the Southeast Coast in harm because you're going to get something to push back this way. Now, again, keep in mind, we have a high pressure system here. So again, unlikely that you see anything come this way. If you had a high pressure system build across the Northeast, then you see something come into the mid-Atlantic. So again, extremely unlikely that we're dealing with any direct impacts of the storm, but definitely not out of the question that the U.S. has to deal with this. It's not the overall prevailing solution that's favored at the moment, but it's certainly a possibility. So we're keeping a close eye on this storm. And we are past peak season. We have only had, let's see here, we're our fifth storm now? So we've only had 5 storms so far, which really just does put us in the analog categories with about 3 other seasons that all were below average seasons as far as accumulated cyclone energy and named storms. So the chances that we end up with a normal season or even an above average season seem to be dwindling at this point in time. So I think it's safe to say that those long range forecasts that were put out at the beginning of the season saying that we were going to have an active but not a hyperactive season, those are busted. It's still possible we get all the way up to a normal season, but we'll really need to start to see the activity pick up, and I just don't see that happening. So I don't think that we're going to get that active season that was forecasted at the beginning of the season. And again, we go back to, well, I reiterate this all the time, I'm not a fan of long-range forecasts just because there are so many possible variabilities, even when things are lining up, like at the beginning of this season, where it looked like we were well on our way to having a very active season. We have these little things that were negatives against that activity, and it basically made the active portion of the forecast null. So that's why I'm not a huge fan of that. You get a lot of these situations where long range looks like this and it ends up being something else just because there's little things that get in the way. So, you have to keep that in mind when you are looking at those longer range forecasts. That's why I'm not a big fan of it. I like things that are a little more predictable than those long range stuff. So for us, as we're looking forward here, we got mostly dry conditions. Probably going to see our Friday, Saturday, and Sunday rain chances jump up just a touch. Probably going to end up going with 20 and 30% across the area for both our coastal and inland areas, just based off of what we observed today. But you'll notice going into next week, temperatures really warming up. That's with that ridge building just off to our west. We're going to have a lot of compressional heating. So I hope you enjoyed the 2 days of false fall. Because we are going to be feeling more like summer than fall as we go through much of next week. But overall, we are talking dry conditions. It's not until maybe next weekend, possibly beyond that we start to see the next frontal boundaries try to come in here and bring us a little bit moisture. And of course, obviously, we'll be paying attention to Fiona and how that solution plays out, how it does inevitably affect our forecast. Because even if we don't see direct impacts, where the storm goes is going to change the overall pattern, and it's going to shape the pattern as well. So that will change our forecast depending on where the system goes. This is what our forecast is based on that system recurving and staying out in the Atlantic. We get the high pressure ridge to build, we get really warm. But if it ends up being further off to the east, say it goes up the eastern seaboard and gets close to the U.S., then we would actually pull down dry air on the backside of that circulation. And that would help lower our temperatures because we would have more dry air, cooler air to come into our area. So it would change that forecast. And if it, went well off to our south, say ended up in the Gulf of Mexico and went toward Mexico or Texas, then certainly we could be talking about that ridge coming further off to the east, which would mean even warmer temperatures than what we even have forecasted here. So obviously Fiona is going to impact the forecast regardless of where it does go. Direct impacts still seem very, very, very unlikely, but we'll watch it. And until we get that recurve, until we get that interaction with the Greater Antilles, we're still going to have those questions because the landmass and shear and redevelopment of centers can always change the forecast. You can keep in mind Dorian back in 2019, we had a redevelopment of the center further off to the north and west, and that completely changed the forecast. So tropical systems, while they're not completely unpredictable, they certainly do things that make the forecast change because forecasting in general is an inexact science, which means that as the variables change, so does the forecast, which is why we're always telling you to check back on the forecast because it's not set in stone. It's going to be an evolving solution as we go forward. This is just what's most probable at this point in time. So that's it. That's all I've got going through it. Let's get to the questions here and see what we got. I think I've answered a couple of these already because should I go to the grocery store and stock up? You should always be prepared. I mean, in the case that this does make a turn and get into the Gulf of Mexico and look like it's going to become a little more likely that it's going to come here, then that's where you'll hear me say, hey, like you've got 4 days, like let's get prepared. Let's act like this system's coming here. I harp on this all the time, but in reality with tropical forecasting, you get 3 days. It's nice whenever they develop way out into the Atlantic and they stay on a consistent path and the forecast is predictable. But most of the time, you get 3 days. When we're 3 days out, we say, okay, we know it's coming here. Here's the impact. Here's the potential impacts, and here's the storm. And that's when you really have to buckle down. 2 days out, we're going to be saying, here's the impacts and what we expect. And then 1 day out, we're going to be saying, this is where we expect the landfall. And then we're going to be talking about, rainfall totals, wind, that kind of stuff. So you get 3 days in reality to actually prepare for a tropical system. Anything beyond that is a luxury if that happens. And most of the time, it does not. Most of the time, you get 3 days. So you might get 5 days of notice of, hey, there's a tropical system could impact us. But in reality of saying the storm is going to come here, 3 days. That's all you're going to get. So this will be impacting Hispaniola sometime on Monday of next week. So we'll have a much better idea by that point in time. And by that point in time, we're still going to be 4 to 5 days out from any potential U.S. impacts. Even if it does take a hard left and go into the peninsula of Florida, we would be, 3 days out at that point in time. So again, reiterating back on that 3-day time frame, even if you were in southern Florida on Monday, you still have 3 days to prepare. So that's why you always want to check back in on the forecast, because it's evolving, it's changing, and you could see those potential change. And you always want more time, not less, to prepare. So check back in on the forecast and see how this does evolve. But that's a good question there. It should always be prepped for tropical stuff. It is tropical season after all. What else? You got anything for me, Spencer?
Where do you recommend people keep up with the forecast and get the latest updates?
Yeah, so Spencer asked what we recommend to keep up with the latest. I would check back in on the newscast, because obviously we're going to be hitting on the tropics every newscast. We're going to be talking about all of those things. And of course, I'm on at 5, 6, and 10 on ABC. You can check me out there. And then we've got Kristen and Grace. Kristen, most of the time and most of the mornings, she's on there as well. And then we've got Grace on the weekend as well. So you can check on the forecast there. You can download the Storm Track 13 app that does have the hurricane models in it. So you can pull up the hurricane models, or what some people call the spaghetti models, because they look like spaghetti noodles thrown on the map. But what all they are is those are each different iterations of different high-resolution models that are concentrated on the storm, and they're showing potential outcomes based on the environment which they can model. So those high-range models, or spaghetti models, those are available on the Storm Track 13 app. So you can pull those up and you can see that, as well as the National Hurricane Center's forecast, the cone of uncertainty, that is also available on the Storm Track 13 app. You can also go to mypanhandle.com and check out all the weather forecasting there as well. There's plenty of information, as well as a tropical page where all of those solutions are also available to you. So check out all of those things if I'm not available. And if you have any direct questions that you want to ask me, you can always reach me on social media. I'm pretty active. I will most of the time read almost every comment that is posted, good, bad, or indifferent. Sometimes I choose not to respond, especially if there is a question that I've already answered. So if you're asking a question and I'm not responding, the chances are I've probably already answered it. You could probably scroll through the comments or look on my page and see that I've already answered it. So that's typically how that goes. So that was a good question as well. Checking my feed here to see what potential questions you have. Let's see here. Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions. I see a lot of comments, but not that many in the way of questions. So, yeah, I see Sandy talking about not a fan of the 90s. Yeah, me neither, Sandy. I'm with you. I'm ready for fall weather to be here to stay, but it doesn't look like we're going to get any really cool air to come crashing down till possibly the end of the month. That looks like when we'll see the pattern kind of changing a little bit. So by the end of the month, we may be talking about some cooler air arriving. Then certainly in October, that's usually our transition month. By the end of the month of October, we usually have several cold fronts coming down, and we get that cooler, drier air to be around a little more consistently. So September can still be very hot. So can early October. But as we get into October, the end of October and November, that's traditionally when we have our fall weather, is usually the end of October and the beginning of November. So good questions there as well. Let's see here. I think that's it. I don't think I'm not seeing a whole lot. So if we don't have anything else to highlight here, then we're going to move on. And of course, if you have any questions or anything that I didn't answer, you can always reach out on social media, or you can check out the newscast 5, 6, and 10. But that's going to do it for now. We'll be likely back next week if we still have tropical activity, and certainly if Fiona is looking a little more threatening or less threatening or whatever early next week, then we'll probably have Kristen on Tuesday do a morning Tropic Topics for all you Tropic Topicers out there. That's probably what we'll do next week, just considering on where the storm could be and what the storm is likely going to be doing at that point in time. So I would say plan on a morning Tuesday Tropic Topic update, and then obviously if needed, we'll do one again next Thursday, probably around the same time. But for now, that's going to do it.
Thank you for watching Tropic Topics, sponsored by Peden Heating and Air Conditioning and Marietta Toyota. Be sure to download the StormTrack 13 app today to stay up to date with all of the latest weather information. For more local news, weather, sports, and more, visit mypanhandle.com.